Venezuela just made the most dangerous naval miscalculation possible, and no one is talking about why. Let me take you back to January 10, 2024. That's the day Venezuela's Navy, in a move that barely registered in Western media, intercepted and boarded a Guyanese-flagged vessel operating in waters off the Essequibo coast. Officially, Caracas called it a routine inspection of a ship conducting seismic surveys in disputed territory. Guyana, backed by the United States, called it an act of piracy. The U.S. Southern Command scrambled surveillance assets. The British sent a warship. And for about 48 hours, the world held its breath, because this wasn't just another border skirmish. This was Venezuela testing the limits of great power tolerance in a way that could have triggered a cascade of miscalculations, the kind that don't end with press releases. I've spent the last 2 decades studying Latin American security crises, and I can tell you what happened in those waters wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate provocation, one that reveals far more about the shifting tectonics of global power than most analysts are willing to admit. And if we don't understand the real stakes here, we're sleepwalking into a conflict that could redefine the Western Hemisphere's balance of power, with consequences that won't stay confined to the Caribbean. The official what they want you to believe. Here's the story you've probably Venezuela, desperate and isolated, is lashing out at its smaller neighbor Guyana over a century-old territorial dispute. The Essequibo region, rich in oil, gold, and timber, has been a point of contention since the 19th century, but tensions flared in 2015 when ExxonMobil discovered massive offshore oil reserves in Guyana's exclusive economic zone. Venezuela, under Nicolas Maduro, responded with a referendum in December 2023, where voters overwhelmingly approved the creation of a new Venezuelan state in Essequibo. Then came the naval incident. Guyana called for international intervention. The U.S. conducted joint military exercises with Guyana's forces. The U.K. deployed the HMS Trent to the region. And the White House issued a stern any Venezuelan aggression would be met with serious consequences. On the surface, it looks like a classic case of a rogue state overplaying its hand. Venezuela's economy is in shambles, its military is underfunded, and its government is recognized by only a handful of allies. The U.S. and its partners have every reason to contain Maduro's ambitions. Case closed, right? But there's a problem with this narrative. It assumes Venezuela is acting irrationally. And in geopolitics, irrational actors don't survive long. Deconstructing the what's really happening. Let's start with the facts that don't fit the official story. First, Venezuela's military isn't as weak as it seems. Yes, the Navy is a shadow of its Cold War self, but it still fields Russian-made Bayan-M corvettes, Iranian-supplied fast attack craft, and a network of coastal defense systems that could make any amphibious invasion a bloody affair. More importantly, Venezuela has been quietly rebuilding its deterrence capabilities with help from Moscow and Tehran. In 2023 alone, Russia delivered advanced air defense systems, and Iran has been assisting with drone and missile programs. This isn't a military on the verge of collapse, it's one that's been recalibrated for asymmetric resistance. Second, the timing of the provocation wasn't random. The boarding happened just days after the U.S. and Guyana signed a new defense cooperation agreement, and weeks after ExxonMobil announced plans to accelerate drilling in the Stabroek Block, the same waters where the incident occurred. Venezuela has been warning for years that foreign oil commies operating in Essequibo are doing so at their own risk. This wasn't a spontaneous act, it was a calculated signal. Third, and most critically, Venezuela isn't acting alone. The Maduro government has been steadily deepening its ties with Russia, China, and Iran, 3 powers that have a vested interest in undermining U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere. In the weeks leading up to the naval incident, Venezuelan officials met with Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov in Caracas. The topic? Strengthening strategic cooperation. Meanwhile, China has been quietly extending its economic footprint in Venezuela, securing long-term oil contracts and infrastructure deals that give Beijing leverage over Caracas. And Iran? Just last year, Venezuela received a shipment of Iranian-made missiles, a move that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. So what's really going on here? Venezuela isn't just making a territorial claim, it's testing the limits of U.S. resolve in what it perceives as a multipolar world. And it's doing so with the backing of powers that see this as an opportunity to erode American hegemony. The broader geopolitical why this matters more than you think. To understand why this naval incident is so dangerous, you have to out. We're not just talking about a border dispute between two small countries. We're talking about the first major test of a new era in great power competition, one where the US is no longer the undisputed hegemon in its own backyard. The US. A hemisphere under threat. For Washington, Venezuela's actions are a direct challenge to the Monroe Doctrine, the 200-year-old principle that the Western Hemisphere is America's sphere of influence. The Biden administration has framed this as a matter of regional stability, but the subtext is if the U.S. allows Venezuela to redraw borders by force, it sends a message to every other revisionist power that American security guarantees are negotiable. That's why the U.S. has responded with military exercises, sanctions, and diplomatic pressure. The problem? None of these tools have worked before, and there's no reason to think they'll work now. Russia's a proxy war in America's backyard. Moscow sees Venezuela as a low-cost way to bleed U.S. attention and resources. Every dollar Washington spends countering Maduro is a dollar not spent in Ukraine or the South China Sea. Russia has been arming Venezuela for years, and in 2023, it even conducted joint naval exercises with the Venezuelan Navy in the Caribbean, a move that was as much about signaling to the U.S. as it was about training. The naval incident in January? That was Russia's way of we can make life difficult for you here, too. China's long economic leverage over military confrontation. Beijing isn't interested in a hot war in the Caribbean, but it is interested in locking Venezuela into its economic orbit. China has already lent Venezuela over $60 billion, most of which Caracas will never repay. In return, China gets access to Venezuela's oil, gold, and rare earth minerals, resources that are critical to its own strategic ambitions. The naval incident was a reminder to the U.S., if you push too hard, we can push back. Iran's shadow deniable escalation. Tehran's involvement is the most underreported aspect of this crisis. Iran has been using Venezuela as a forward operating base for years, smuggling oil, training militias, and even establishing drone factories. The recent missile shipments are just the latest escalation. For Iran, Venezuela is a pressure valve, a way to retaliate against U.S. sanctions without directly confronting American forces. The naval incident was a how far can we go before the U.S. responds? This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the future of American power. And the most dangerous part? The U.S. is playing this game with one hand tied behind its back. Military why this could spiral out of control. Let's talk about the military dimension, because this is where things get really dangerous. Venezuela's deterrence strategy. Maduro knows he can't win a conventional war against the U.S. or Guyana. But he doesn't need to. His strategy is based on asymmetric escalation, using irregular forces, cyber attacks, and proxy groups to make any intervention too costly. Venezuela's military doctrine, influenced by Russia and Iran, emphasizes hybrid warfare, sabotage, disinformation, and deniable attacks. The naval incident wasn't just about seizing a ship, it was a demonstration of Venezuela's ability to disrupt maritime traffic in the Caribbean, a choke point for global trade. The U.S. A high-stakes bluff? The U.S. has responded with shows of force, military exercises, warship deployments, and economic sanctions. But here's the none of these tools have worked in the past. Sanctions have only strengthened Maduro's grip on power by creating a siege mentality. Military exercises are useful for signaling, but they don't change facts on the ground. And if the U.S. were to launch a limited strike, say, against a Venezuelan naval base, it would risk triggering a wider conflict with Russia and Iran. The escalation, how this could go wrong. Let's game this out. Suppose Venezuela seizes another ship. The U.S. responds with airstrikes on Venezuelan coastal defenses. Russia, under the guise of protecting its interests, sends military advisors to Caracas. Iran activates its proxy networks in Latin America, targeting U.S. personnel or infrastructure. Suddenly, the U.S. is facing a multi-front crisis, one that could distract from its priorities in Europe and Asia. This isn't hypothetical. We've seen this movie before in Syria, in Ukraine, in Yemen. The difference? This time, it's happening 1,500 miles from Miami. The domestic political why Biden can't afford to back down. Here's where things get even more complicated. The Biden administration isn't just responding to a geopolitical threat, it's responding to a political one. The swing state that could swing the election. Florida is the ultimate swing state, and Venezuelan American voters are a critical bloc. They're overwhelmingly anti-Maduro, and they expect the U.S. to take a hard line against his regime. If Biden appears weak on Venezuela, he risks losing Florida, and with it, the election. That's why the administration has been so vocal about defending Guyana. It's not just about oil, it's about votes. The hawkish turn in U.S. foreign policy. The Biden administration has been under pressure from both sides of the aisle to take a tougher stance on Venezuela. Republicans have accused the White House of being soft on Maduro, while progressives have criticized the administration's continued use of sanctions. The result? A foreign policy that's reactive, inconsistent, and increasingly militarized. The risk of mission creep. The biggest danger here is that the U.S. gets dragged into a conflict it doesn't want. Every time the administration draws a red line, it creates an incentive for Venezuela to test it. And if the U.S. responds with force, it risks triggering a wider war, one that could destabilize the entire region. Scenario how this could play out. So where does this go from here? Let's look at the three most likely scenarios. Scenario 1, controlled escalation. In this scenario, Venezuela continues to probe U.S. and Guyanese resolve with limited provocations, seizing another ship, conducting cyber attacks, or harassing oil rigs. The U.S. responds with targeted sanctions and military exercises, but avoids direct confrontation. Russia and China provide just enough support to keep Maduro afloat, but not enough to trigger a major crisis. The status quo holds, but tensions remain high. Scenario 2, limited military confrontation. This is the most dangerous scenario. Venezuela, emboldened by its backers, escalates further, perhaps by declaring a blockade of Guyanese waters or attacking an oil installation. The U.S., under domestic pressure, responds with airstrikes or a naval blockade. Russia and Iran retaliate indirectly, either through cyber attacks or by activating proxy groups in Latin America. The conflict remains contained, but the risk of miscalculation is high. Scenario 3, regional war. This is the nightmare scenario. A Venezuelan attack on Guyana triggers a U.S. military intervention. Russia and Iran respond by increasing their support for Maduro, leading to a proxy war in the Caribbean. Colombia, Brazil, and other regional powers are drawn in. Oil prices skyrocket. The U.S. finds itself bogged down in a conflict it can't win, while its adversaries exploit the distraction elsewhere. None of these scenarios are good. But the most likely outcome, the one we should be preparing for, is a prolonged period of low-intensity conflict, where Venezuela, backed by its allies, continues to test U.S. resolve without crossing the threshold of all-out war. The grand strategy why the U.S. keeps losing. Here's the hard: the U.S. has no coherent strategy for dealing with Venezuela. And that's not an accident, it's the result of a broader failure in American grand strategy. The myth of liberal hegemony. For the last 3 decades, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that it can reshape the world in its own image. The result? Endless wars, failed states, and a growing list of adversaries. Venezuela is just the latest example of this hubris. The U.S. has tried sanctions, regime change, and military threats, none of which have worked. And yet, the default response is always the more pressure, more coercion, more force. The realist alternative. A realist approach would recognize that the U.S. can't control every square inch of the globe. It would focus on managing great power competition, not trying to dominate it. In Venezuela's case, that means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere and that the U.S. needs to find a way to coexist with him, even if it doesn't like him. The Cuban Missile Crisis. This isn't the first time the U.S. has faced a hostile regime in its backyard. In 1962, the Kennedy administration stared down the Soviet Union over missiles in Cuba. The difference? Kennedy understood that the goal wasn't to eliminate Castro, it was to prevent a nuclear war. Today, the U.S. seems to have forgotten that lesson. We're not dealing with a nuclear power, but the principle is sometimes the best strategy is containment, not confrontation. What should be done instead? So what's the alternative? Here's what a smart, realist strategy would look like. 1. Stop the sanctions regime. Sanctions haven't worked. They've only strengthened Maduro's grip on power by creating a siege mentality. Instead of trying to strangle Venezuela's economy, the U.S. should offer conditional sanctions relief in exchange for concessions like allowing international observers to monitor elections or reducing military cooperation with Russia and Iran. 2. Engage with Venezuela's backers. The U.S. can't ignore Russia, China, and Iran's involvement in Venezuela. But it can negotiate. Russia wants sanctions relief for its own economy. China wants stability in its oil supplies. Iran wants to avoid a direct confrontation with the U.S. The U.S. should use these interests as leverage to de-escalate the crisis. 3. Strengthen regional alliances. The U.S. should work with Brazil, Colombia, and other regional powers to contain Venezuela's aggression. But it should do so without dictating terms. Latin America is tired of being treated as America's backyard. A more collaborative approach would yield better results. 4. Prepare for the long game. Venezuela isn't going to collapse anytime soon. The U.S. needs to accept that Maduro is a reality and plan accordingly. That means investing in deterrence, but also in diplomacy. It means recognizing that the era of unipolarity is over, and that the U.S. needs to adapt to a multipolar world. This is bigger than Venezuela. Let me be, this isn't just about a border dispute. It's about the future of American power. Venezuela's naval miscalculation was a test of U.S. resolve, of great power tolerance, and of the rules-based order. And if the U.S. responds with more of the same, more sanctions, more threats, more military posturing, it will fail. The real danger isn't that Venezuela will invade Guyana. It's that the U.S. will overreact, triggering a crisis that spirals out of control. And in a world where Russia, China, and Iran are all looking for ways to undermine American influence, that's a risk we can't afford to take. The question isn't whether the U.S. can afford to back down. It's whether it can afford not to. And right now, the answer isn't clear. What is clear is that the old playbook isn't working. It's time for a new approach, one that recognizes the limits of American power and the realities of a multipolar world. Because if we don't learn from Venezuela, we'll be doomed to repeat the same mistakes again and again and again. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's naval miscalculation wasn't just a blunder, it was a symptom of something far more: the unraveling of America's ability to shape outcomes in its own hemisphere. For decades, Washington operated under the assumption that Latin America was a zone of uncontested influence, where military threats could be met with sanctions, diplomatic isolation, or, if absolutely necessary, a quick show of force. But that world is gone. The question now isn't whether the U.S. can still enforce its will in the region, it's whether it can even recognize the new rules of the game. Let me explain why this matters. When Maduro sent those patrol boats into Guyanese waters in December 2023, he wasn't just testing Guyana's resolve. He was testing the entire post-Cold War security architecture in the Western Hemisphere. And the fact that he did so with Russian warships loitering in the Caribbean, Chinese oil tankers docking in Venezuelan ports, and Iranian drones being assembled in Maracay tells you everything you need to know about how much the strategic landscape has shifted. This wasn't a rogue operation. It was a coordinated provocation, designed to see how far the U.S. could be pushed before it either overreacted or backed down. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. didn't have a good answer. The Biden administration's response: a mix of stern warnings, increased naval patrols, and This is the military implication. No one in Washington wants to. America's coercive power in Latin America is eroding, and fast. The U.S. Southern Command still has more firepower than any other military in the region, but firepower alone doesn't win modern conflicts. What wins is the ability to project influence without triggering a backlash, to deter without escalating, and to shape outcomes without being seen as the aggressor. And right now, the U.S. is failing on all three counts. Take the case of Brazil. In January 2024, Lula da Silva, no friend of Maduro, but also no fan of U.S. hegemony, publicly warned against any military intervention in Venezuela. That wasn't just a diplomatic nicety. It was a signal that even America's closest regional partners are no longer willing to rubber-stamp Washington's playbook. Colombia, once a reliable U.S. ally, has also been hedging its bets, engaging with Venezuela on migration and energy while keeping its distance from any military confrontation. And then there's Mexico, which has quietly deepened its ties with both Russia and China while avoiding direct criticism of Maduro. The message is Latin America is diversifying its alliances, and the U.S. can no longer take its dominance for granted. Now, let's talk about the military dimension. The U.S. has responded to Venezuela's provocations by increasing its naval presence in the Caribbean, including the deployment of the USS George Washington Carrier Strike Group in early 2024. On paper, that's a show of force. In reality, it's a sign of weakness. Why? Because carrier strike groups are designed for high-intensity warfare, not gray-zone conflicts. They're a blunt instrument in a world that demands precision. Maduro knows this. He also knows that the U.S. can't keep a carrier in the Caribbean indefinitely. It's too expensive, too politically fraught, and too vulnerable to asymmetric threats like Iranian-made drones or Russian electronic warfare systems. This is where the real danger lies. The more the U.S. relies on military posturing, the more it plays into the hands of its adversaries. Russia and China don't need to defeat the U.S. in a direct confrontation, they just need to make sure America's military commitments become unsustainable. Every time the U.S. sends a carrier to the Caribbean, it's a victory for Moscow and Beijing, because it stretches American resources thinner, fuels domestic fatigue, and reinforces the narrative that the U.S. is an overstretched empire. And every time the U.S. backs down from a confrontation, like it did in Syria in 2013 or Afghanistan in 2021, it emboldens revisionist powers to test the limits again. So what's the alternative? The U.S. needs to stop thinking in binary terms, either military intervention or passive acceptance, and start playing the long game. That means three things. First, it means recognizing that economic statecraft is more effective than military coercion in the 21st century. The U.S. still has the world's most powerful financial tools, from the dollar's dominance to the reach of the Treasury sanctions regime. But it's using them poorly. Instead of broad-based sanctions that hurt ordinary Venezuelans and push Maduro closer to Russia and China, the U.S. should target the regime's inner circle with precision. Freeze the assets of Venezuelan officials and their families in Miami, London, and Dubai. Cut off their access to the global banking system. And most importantly, offer a clear-off sanctions relief in exchange for verifiable concessions, like free elections or the withdrawal of troops from Guyana's border. Second, the U.S. needs to rebuild its alliances in Latin America not as a patron, but as a partner. That means listening to regional leaders instead of lecturing them. It means working with Brazil to stabilize Venezuela's economy, not just isolating it. It means helping Colombia manage the migration crisis without demanding loyalty in return. And it means accepting that Latin America will have its own foreign policy, one that doesn't always align with Washington's. The era of the Monroe Doctrine is over. The U.S. needs to act like it. Third, the U.S. must prepare for the possibility that Maduro isn't going anywhere. That doesn't mean accepting his authoritarianism, but it does mean planning for a world where Venezuela remains a Russian and Chinese client state. That could involve everything from increasing intelligence sharing with Guyana to pre-positioning military assets in the region to deter further aggression. But it also means avoiding the trap of treating Venezuela as an existential threat. It's not. It's a nuisance, a distraction, and a symptom of a larger geopolitical shift. The real battle is for influence in the global south, and the U.S. is losing it. Let me be none of this is easy. The U.S. political system is designed for short-term thinking, not strategic patience. The Pentagon is built for war, not gray-zone competition. And the American public has little appetite for another foreign entanglement, especially in a region many see as peripheral. But the alternative, continuing to rely on the same failed policies, is far worse. Because if the U.S. doesn't adapt, it won't just lose Venezuela. It will lose Latin America. And in a world where China is already the top trading partner for most of the region, that's a loss America can't afford. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's naval miscalculation wasn't just a blunder, it was a symptom of something far more: the complete collapse of institutional checks within the Chavista regime. Maduro didn't wake up one morning and decide to provoke Guyana on a whim. This was a calculated gamble, born from years of internal power struggles where the military's hardliners have steadily outmaneuvered the pragmatists. And if we want to understand where this is headed, we need to look at who's really calling the shots in Caracas. Let's start with the Nicolas Maduro is not the strongman he pretends to be. He's a survivor, not a strategist. His power rests on a fragile coalition of military factions, corrupt elites, and a handful of civilian loyalists who know that if the regime falls, they'll either end up in a Miami courtroom or a Venezuelan prison. But here's the uncomfortable: the real power brokers in Venezuela today aren't the politicians in Miraflores Palace, they're the generals in Fuerte Tiuna, the intelligence chiefs in Seban, and the shadowy figures running the gold and cocaine trade. And they're the ones who pushed for this Guyana adventure. Take Diosdado Cabello, for example. The former National Assembly president and current head of the Constituent Assembly isn't just another Chavista apparatchik, he's the regime's enforcer, the man who ensures the military stays loyal through a mix of patronage and fear. Cabello has spent the last decade consolidating control over the armed forces, purging officers who might challenge him and replacing them with loyalists who owe their careers to him. When Maduro announced the annexation referendum last December, it wasn't just a political stunt, it was a test of Cabello's influence. And when the military brass fell in line, it sent a clear: the hardliners are in charge. Then there's Vladimir Padrino Lopez, the defense minister and the public face of Venezuela's military. Padrino is a fascinating case study in how authoritarian regimes co-opt their generals. He's not a true believer in Chavismo, he's a career officer who rose through the ranks during the pre-Chavez era. But he's also a survivor, and he knows that his best chance of avoiding prosecution for human rights abuses is to keep Maduro in power. That's why he's been so vocal in supporting the Guyana operation, even as the international backlash grows. It's not about ideology, it's about self-preservation. But here's where things get really dangerous. The military's support for Maduro isn't monolithic. There are factions, some who want to double down on confrontation with the West, others who recognize that Venezuela's economy can't survive another round of sanctions. The problem is that the hardliners are winning. Why? Because they control the money. The gold mines in Bolivar State, the cocaine routes through the Caribbean, the oil smuggling operations, these are the lifelines of the regime, and the generals who run them have no incentive to back down. Now, let's talk about the domestic political dimensions. Maduro's decision to escalate with Guyana wasn't just about distracting from Venezuela's economic collapse, though that was certainly part of it. It was also about consolidating power ahead of the 2024 presidential election. The regime knows it can't win a free and fair vote, so it's doing everything it can to ensure the election is neither free nor fair. The Guyana crisis is a perfect tool for that. By portraying himself as a defender of Venezuela's sovereignty, Maduro can rally nationalist sentiment, justify crackdowns on the opposition, and create a siege mentality that makes dissent seem like treason. But here's the: it might not work. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado, has been surprisingly resilient. Despite being barred from running, despite the arrests of her allies, despite the regime's best efforts to fracture her coalition, she's still the most popular political figure in Venezuela. The problem is that the opposition is divided between those who want to participate in the election no matter how rigged it is, and those who believe any participation legitimizes the regime. That division is exactly what Maduro wants. If the opposition boycotts, he wins by default. If they participate, he can manipulate the results. Either way, he stays in power. So what happens next? Let's game out a few scenarios. The first, and most likely, is that Maduro muddles through. The international backlash fades, the sanctions relief he's been promised by the US never materializes, and Venezuela's economy continues its slow-motion collapse. The military hardliners keep their grip on power, the opposition remains divided, and Maduro limps toward another 6 years in office. In this scenario, Venezuela becomes a failed state in slow motion, a country with vast oil reserves but no functioning economy, a government that survives on repression and foreign patronage, and a population that either flees or resigns itself to misery. It's not a pretty picture, but it's the most probable one. The second scenario is more escalation. Maduro, emboldened by the lack of a strong international response, decides to push further. Maybe he sends troops into Guyana's Essequibo region. Maybe he seizes an oil rig. Maybe he provokes a skirmish with the U.S. Navy. In this scenario, the U.S. and its allies are forced to respond, either with military force or with devastating sanctions that cut Venezuela off from the global financial system. The problem is that Maduro has no exit strategy. If he backs down, he looks weak. If he doubles down, he risks a conflict he can't win. And in a regime where the military's loyalty is bought, not earned, that's a recipe for disaster. The third scenario is the wild military coup. It's unlikely, but not impossible. The Venezuelan military is not a monolith, and there are officers who recognize that the country is on a path to ruin. If the economy collapses further, if the sanctions bite harder, if the regime's internal divisions deepen, a faction of the military might decide that Maduro is more of a liability than an asset. The problem is that any coup would be messy. The hardliners would fight back, the opposition would be caught in the middle, and the country could descend into chaos. And in a region where coups have a long and bloody history, that's a risk no one should take lightly. Now, let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela's borders. Because what's happening in Caracas isn't just about one country, it's about the future of Latin America. The region is at a crossroads. On one side, you have the rise of leftist populists like Lula in Brazil, Petro in Colombia, and Boric in Chile, who are trying to chart a middle path between Washington and Beijing. On the other side, you have the authoritarian regimes in Nicaragua, Cuba, and now Venezuela, which are increasingly aligned with Russia and China. The question: which model will prevail? The U.S. has a choice to make. It can continue to treat Latin America as a backyard, lecturing its leaders and imposing sanctions that only push them closer to Moscow and Beijing. Or it can recognize that the region is growing up, that it has its own interests and its own agency, and that the only way to counter Russian and Chinese influence is to offer a better alternative. That means trade, investment, and respect, not threats and ultimatums. But here's the U.S. political system isn't built for that kind of long-term thinking. The Biden administration has made some progress, offering limited sanctions relief in exchange for electoral concessions. But it's not enough. The U.S. needs to go further, lifting sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, reopening diplomatic channels, and working with regional partners to stabilize the country's economy. And it needs to do it without demanding loyalty in return. Because if the U.S. doesn't act, someone else will. China is already Venezuela's largest creditor, with over $60 billion in loans since 2007. Russia has supplied weapons, intelligence support, and political cover at the United Nations. And Iran has helped Venezuela evade sanctions by providing oil for gold swaps and technical expertise. The more isolated Venezuela becomes, the more it will turn to these partners. And the more it turns to them, the harder it will be for the U.S. to shape the region's future. So where does that leave us? With a regime that's desperate, a region that's divided, and a superpower that's distracted. It's not a recipe for stability. But it's also not a reason for despair. Because here's the thing about it's not a chess game where one side wins and the other loses. It's a series of moves and countermoves, where the best players are the ones who can adapt, who can see the long game, and who can turn setbacks into opportunities. The U.S. has made mistakes in Latin America, plenty of them. But it's not too late to change course. The question is whether Washington has the political will to do it. Because if it doesn't, the next naval miscalculation won't be Venezuela's last. And the consequences won't just be felt in Caracas, they'll be felt across the hemisphere. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the future of U.S. influence in the Western Hemisphere at a time when the rules of the game are being rewritten. The 20th century was defined by American hegemony in Latin America, a dominance so complete that even the Cold War's proxy battles, Guatemala in '54, Chile in '73, Nicaragua in the '80s, were ultimately contained within Washington's sphere. But the 21st century is different. The rise of China as a global creditor, Russia's resurgence as a disruptive power, and the erosion of U.S. soft power under the weight of its own contradictions have created a multipolar reality that Washington is still struggling to accept. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's naval miscalculation wasn't just a tactical error, it was a symptom of a deeper strategic the assumption that the US would always be the only game in town. For 2 decades, Chavez and Maduro have bet that they could play the great powers against each other, leveraging oil, gold, and geopolitical chaos to extract concessions. And for most of that time, they've been right. But the Essequibo crisis exposed the limits of that strategy. When push came to shove, neither China nor Russia was willing to risk a direct confrontation with the US over a territorial dispute that didn't directly threaten their core interests. That's the uncomfortable. Venezuela's allies are transactional, not ideological. They'll take the oil, the gold, the political cover, but they won't go to war for Caracas. Here's where the grand strategy comes into play. The US has 2 broad options, neither of them perfect. The first is the path of doubling down on sanctions, supporting opposition figures like Maria Corina Machado, and waiting for the regime to collapse under the weight of its own dysfunction. This is the default position of the Washington establishment, and it's not without merit. The Venezuelan economy is a basket case. GDP has contracted by 75% since 2013, hyperinflation has wiped out savings, and over 7 million people have fled the country. The regime's legitimacy is paper-thin, propped up by repression and foreign patronage. But containment has a fatal. It assumes that time is on America's side. It isn't. Every day that Venezuela remains isolated, China and Russia dig in deeper. Every day that sanctions strangle the economy, the regime's survival becomes more dependent on external lifelines. And every day that the US refuses to engage, it cedes ground to its rivals. The second option is engagement, real engagement, not the half measures we've seen so far. This would mean lifting sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector in exchange for verifiable democratic reforms, reopening the US embassy in Caracas, and working with regional partners like Brazil and Colombia to stabilize the country's economy. It would mean recognizing that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term and that the only way to counter Russian and Chinese influence is to offer a better deal. This isn't about rewarding a dictator, it's about recognizing reality. The alternative is a Venezuela that drifts further into the orbit of America's adversaries, a failed state on the doorstep of the US that becomes a hub for illicit finance, drug trafficking, and geopolitical instability. Now, I can already hear the objections. Engagement is appeasement. Sanctions are working. The regime is on its last legs. But let's be, none of that is true. Sanctions have hurt the Venezuelan people far more than they've hurt the regime. The opposition is fractured, with Machado's hardline stance alienating moderates and playing into Maduro's hands. And the idea that the regime is on the brink of collapse has been the conventional wisdom in Washington for a decade. It's a fantasy. The uncomfortable truth is that the US has been playing checkers while its adversaries play chess. China and Russia don't care about democracy or human rights, they care about access to Venezuela's oil, its gold reserves, and its strategic location. And they're willing to play the long game. So what's the alternative? A hybrid approach, one that combines targeted pressure with pragmatic engagement. The US could, for example, offer to lift sanctions on Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, in exchange for free and fair elections, the release of political prisoners, and the demilitarization of the Essequibo dispute. It could work with the UN to establish a transitional justice mechanism to hold the regime accountable for its crimes while offering a path to reintegration into the global economy. And it could use its influence with the IMF and World Bank to provide debt relief and economic stabilization packages, conditional on reforms, but not on regime change. This isn't about being soft on Maduro. It's about being smart. The US has spent the last 2 decades trying to isolate Venezuela, and all it's accomplished is to push the country into the arms of its adversaries. It's time to try something different. Because here's the thing about grand, it's not about winning every battle. It's about positioning yourself to win the war. And right now, the US is losing. Let me give you an example. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaido as Venezuela's interim president, freezing the country's assets in US banks and handing control of PDVSA's US subsidiary, Citgo, to the opposition. It was a bold move, but it backfired. The regime responded by deepening its ties with Russia and China, selling off Citgo's assets to pay off debts, and cracking down on dissent. Meanwhile, the US was left holding the bag with no leverage, no influence, and no plan B. That's not strategy. That's wishful thinking. The Biden administration has been slightly more pragmatic, offering limited sanctions relief in exchange for electoral concessions. But it's not enough. The US needs to go all in, lifting sanctions, reopening diplomatic channels, and offering a clear path to reintegration. And it needs to do it without demanding loyalty in return. Because if the US doesn't act, someone else will. China is already Venezuela's largest creditor, with over $60 billion in loans since 2007. Russia has supplied weapons, intelligence support, and political cover at the UN. And Iran has helped Venezuela evade sanctions by providing oil for gold swaps and technical expertise. The more isolated Venezuela becomes, the more it will turn to these partners. And the more it turns to them, the harder it will be for the US to shape the region's future. Here's the reflective closing. The Venezuela crisis is a microcosm of the broader challenges facing US foreign policy in the 21st century. The old playbook, sanctions, regime change, and military threats, no longer works in a world where power is diffuse and adversaries are willing to play the long game. The US needs a new approach, one that combines strength with pragmatism, pressure with engagement, and idealism with realism. It needs to recognize that the world has changed, and that the only way to counter Russian and Chinese influence is to offer a better alternative. That means trade, investment, and respect, not threats and ultimatums. It means working with regional partners to stabilize the hemisphere, rather than dictating terms from Washington. And it means accepting that the US can't always get what it wants, but that it can still shape the outcome if it's willing to play the game. The question is whether Washington has the political will to do it. Because if it doesn't, the next naval miscalculation won't be Venezuela's last. And the consequences won't just be felt in Caracas, they'll be felt across the hemisphere, in the form of a failed state on America's doorstep, a hub for illicit finance and geopolitical instability, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of strategic myopia. The choice is clear. The US can either double down on a failed strategy or adapt to a new reality. The clock is ticking. And the stakes couldn't be higher.